a child born in the Northwest Frontier Territory. This was not yet a state. It was an accumulation of people who were largely fur traders. There weren't even many settlers coming in at this point in history. He spent much of his life unaware that a big part of his heritage was that of a native tribe of the Chinooks. His name, Ranald, means ruler's counselor. It's the Scottish version of Ronald, and his father was Scottish. His grandfather, however, was Comcomly, who lived from 1960 until 1830. He was the chief of the Chinook tribe. An Englishman described him as a little one-eyed man who had endeared himself to everyone on board the ship. It turns out that Ranald had that ability to also be a friend to everyone he met. When Lewis and Clark arrived, he was the second in command of his community. And by 1811, he was the ruler of the Chinook community. Two of his sons died in the epidemics that the settlers brought with them, and three of his daughters married into the fur trade, one of those being Ranald's mother. And this was the region where the tribe was settled. Comcomly lived in a cedar longhouse. His community had about 500 people in it, and they lived very close by. There were few villagers who provided other services as they needed. This particular tribe, being a West Coast tribe, was fairly rich, and he had worked very hard to make it a trade center for the native tribes even before the English and the Scottish arrived. Archibald MacDonald was Ranald's father. He was born in Scotland and was a native Gaelic speaker with English as his second language. In 1830, he immigrated to something called the Red River Colony, which is where Manitoba is now, and worked his way up to become the deputy governor. In 1820, he said, "This colony is not for me," and moved on to the Hudson Bay Company. And his first post was at Fort George. He had two marriages. One was to Ranald's mother, Princess Raven, also known as Princess Sunday. They had the one son, which is Ranald. Jane Klein was his second wife. She was of French and Native heritage. They married in 1825. They had 12 sons and one daughter. So Ranald was rich in step-siblings, and he continued to be in contact with many of them through his life. Archibald retired in Canada and died in 1853. This is a drawing of the two parents for Ranald. Shortly, it could be considered a marriage portrait, essentially. She was Comcomly's youngest daughter, and she was the third to marry into the fur trade. Comcomly wanted to make those alliances. She died either in childbirth or shortly after Ranald was born. And Archibald lived in bachelor quarters at that point. And so Ranald was left with the tribe for 2.5 years, and his maternal aunt raised him at that point until his father remarried. They have reconstructed Fort George. This is not the original. And that's where the family lived when their father was stationed there. It is now Astoria, and that was where Ranald was born. They have a plaque to him there. And this highlights the reason why he continues to fascinate people who know about him. He is known as the first teacher of English in Japan. And that was while Japan was closed to all foreigners except Dutch traders, and a few Chinese. It was very daring of Ranald to have decided to go there when he did. Within 4 years of Ranald's birth, there were major epidemics that killed 4/5 of the native population. That included his grandfather. Ranald was 6 years old when his grandfather died. It's believed that the family did not talk about the first marriage and those connections. And no one is quite sure when Ranald learned that he had native heritage. So a Hudson Bay Company man named George Simpson decided that Fort George was not good enough or efficient enough, and so he wanted to move the trade company to Fort Vancouver. Ranald started school here at age 10. By then, he already had multiple step siblings. In 1834, a group of Japanese sailors turned up in the Pacific Northwest. And we wonder if this was how Ranald first got interested in Japan, because these three men were brought to Fort Vancouver, but it was after Ranald had been shipped off to school in another community. The Japanese castaways of 1834 were called the Three Kitchis. That refers to the fact that all of their last names ended in K-I-C-H-I-S. The ship that they were on originally had been carrying rice, porcelain, and a crew of 14 people. They were headed to Edo, or Tokyo, which was the capital of Japan at the time. They were caught in a typhoon, and they drifted 5,000 miles. They landed on the northwest coast, and there were only 3 survivors. Most of the people died of scurvy. The navigator was one of the survivors. He was 28 years old, and 2 apprentice cooks, 14 and 15 years old, survived. When they turned up, the Mackay tribe found them first. And when George Simpson heard about them in Fort Vancouver, he decided that he had to rescue them from the tribe. It was known that the tribe kept slaves and that they may have endured some rough treatment. From there, the 3 men learned some English. They were sent to London, then to Macau, which we now speak of as Hong Kong, and that was a Japanese territory. They never went directly back to Japan. The one time a ship tried to take them there, the Japanese fired on it, and the ship retreated. Only one of these 3 men ever went back to Japan, and that was quite late in his lifetime. Meanwhile, Ranald has been shipped off to the school in Red River, while his father gets a break and goes back to England, to Great Britain. This happened with the fur traders in the company. They were allowed a year off to return to their native country. When he came back, he picked up his wife and the youngest children and went back to Fort Colville and left Ranald and 4 of his brothers in school at Red River Valley, the community where his father had first landed. And his father was very interested that Ranald learn carpentry skills. He thought that he would probably not get much of an education and that he should have a working skill. However, after 4 years at Red River, the father arranged for Ranald to go to St. Thomas, Ontario. And in Ontario, he was given a position as a bank clerk. He was an apprentice as a bank clerk, and he really hated it. It's suggested in one biography that in his spare time, this was when he started to study Japanese. So he decided that he could not take life as a banker and decided to ship out. He had researched several other options. Ranald considered joining the military, but at that point you had to buy your way in, and his father wasn't willing to do that. He had his heart broken. It may have been because he was of mixed heritage, and the woman was a settler, the child of settlers. And his father threatened to bring him back and have him work for the Hudson Bay Company. And for him, that was no better than working in a bank. So Ranald skipped out. Having written a letter to his father, he ran away. He turned up in Minnesota, then signed up as a deckhand on a Mississippi riverboat. From there, he went to New Orleans and then to New York. Having worked on a riverboat, he thought that he might find an ocean-going vessel more interesting. And on ocean-going vessels, he went to Calcutta, Liverpool, and San Francisco. This was even before he conceived of the idea or went public with the idea of going to Japan. In 1845 to 48, Ranald signed on with a whaling ship called the Plymouth. Whaling ships set out from New England and they sailed around South America, no Panama Canal yet, and many of them ended up around North Japan because the whaling fields there were incredible and they could fill their holds very quickly. Most whaling ships were out for as much as 3 years at a time.
Wow.
However, these wonderful fields in Japan were a problem because the Japanese would not allow anybody to land there and restock their supplies. So they had to go all the way back to Hawaii and load up supplies and then head back to the whaling fields again. The Plymouth was actually a fairly large ship, 425 tons. The crew was 30, and they came from a lot of different nations and races. Because what would happen is whenever a whaling ship landed to get more supplies, some of the sailors would leave because they were home or because they were sick, and new people would be hired. So it was actually a constantly rotating crew. The goal for the Plymouth was to load up 5,000 barrels of oil. And generally, when they got back and sold the oil, the profit was split among the sailors who were there. And it could be a very good profit. On the other hand, it was 3 years of a very rough life. It took them 5.5 months just to reach Hawaii from Sag Harbor in New York. So when they reached Japan, they tended to head up to Hokkaido at the north end of Japan, an island of the north end of Japan, or even farther north. There was some risk at that point, not just from the Japanese, but from the Russians who claimed a part of those islands. During the trip, they stopped at a number of ports, and Ranald kept a journal, and we know that these ports included Formosa, and they did stop in China. It took them 3 years to reach the Sea of Japan. At this point, Ranald was 24 years old, and he decided he wanted to make his way into a country that had been closed to foreigners for 200 years. Japan had closed itself off in the 1600s, in part out of fear of Europeans. Most of them at that point were Portuguese. And the Christian religion, the Portuguese sent in a lot of people interested, missionaries interested in converting the Japanese to Christianity. And this did not work for the shogun. So he expelled them. The Japanese who converted to Christianity could be treated very harshly. and were at one point put to death. So at 24 years old, MacDonald's sitting on a whaling boat, and he creates an agreement with the captain. When the boat has its tons of oil, the captain will give him a small boat with a sail, 36 days of provisions, and he can take his box of books, his papers, and his clothing with him. He was also given $600 in cash, which would have been a part of his whaling proceeds. And he had a quadrant to help him find his direction. It's a navigational tool, but no chart of Japan. So he sets off in this little boat, and he comes across the island of Yankashiri, and he pulls the boat up there and spends 3 days there because he wants to give the whaling ship time to get away so that his lies to the Japanese sound more believable when he finally does land on an inhabited island. He believed that Yankashiri was uninhabited. Although he never knew this, there were actually a small Japanese colony on the other side of the island from where he landed. He slept on that tiny little boat for 2 nights. And then he decided to practice capsizing the boat, because to convince the Japanese that he needed to be rescued, the boat needed to look like it was in trouble. So he flipped over the boat to make sure that he could actually right it if he needed to. Unfortunately, he hadn't offloaded what he owned. So all of that stuff ended up in the sea, and he had to recover it. Sadly, the rudder was lost permanently, as was one of his 2 pistols. The lost rudder was found and reported in an English language newspaper. At that point, his father came to believe that he was probably dead and had to go through the process of mourning. Much of what we know about Ranald MacDonald was written down years later in a memoir. There's a journal that he kept during this period and a number of word lists. As he encountered different people, he wrote down their words. So that would include the Ainu, who lived on the island where he first landed and met people, the Japanese, and the Dutch. And these survive in the archives in British Columbia at the Royal Museum. The ocean waters around the island where he planned to land, Rashiri Island, were very, very rough and make for a difficult landing. He once again practiced upsetting his boat, and this time he had left his darn sea chest unlocked. So he lost his sea biscuit and his compass, and that night, when he finally righted the boat, he slept at sea. So the populated island that he landed on was Rashiri Island. This was 1848. There is a cone in the middle of the island that was at one time a volcano, which is now extinct. And it's a relatively small island with only 2 villages on it. So when he approaches the island, he pulls the plug. He lets the boat fill up about halfway with water and puts the plug back in. When a Rashiri boat comes out towards him, he signals to them that he needs them to help him bail out his boat. They just draw him alongside and take him back to the island. When he was there, he spent 10 days in Notsuka. Mostly, the tribal people here left him free to roam the island. He was given a room, he was given food. The very first day, they went through all his belongings, his books, his papers, his clothing. On the second day, the two Japanese overseers came to examine him as well. One of them goes on to Soya, which is the second community that Ranald will travel to report up the Japanese chain. Now, this was 30 miles by boat, and they had no steam and no engines, so this was by sail. So it took several days. On the whole, it's a lovely island. These are some of the wildflowers to be found there. The culture that Ranald found there was the Ainu, A-I-N-U. And this was a tribal culture that lived on both Russian and Japanese claimed islands. So it sounds as though they were there before the Russians and the Japanese were. And this is a portrait of the Ainu culture. They differ from the Japanese in that they have light skin, a stout frame, deep set eyes with a European shape, thick wavy hair. They may actually have blue eyes. Their traditional dress, like that of the tribes that Ranald came from, the Chinook tribe, wore bark cloth. The men wore heavy beards, and the women actually had facial tattoos, which Ranald found kind of disgusting. They were primarily a hunting and gathering culture. Their language has no written form, so that we have no records from them about Ranald. It had 3 dialects. The language itself is mostly extinct. What happened was that the Japanese were forcing them to assimilate, and they discriminated against the people, especially if they used their own language. Almost as soon as Ranald finished his first meal, they gave him fish, rice, pickled vegetables, and sake, although Ranald was a temperance man, so he didn't drink the sake. He started to write down the words he heard. The Ainu, very much like the tribes in Northwest America, lived in permanent villages and something that very much resembled a longhouse. Each kotan, or permanent village, had a headman, and inside the reed walls of each house, a nuclear family lived. And they gathered around one central hearth. This was a very salmon-rich land, so they ate very much what the ocean-dwelling native populations in the Northwest did. And they worshipped the bear, or had at least a number of bear ceremonies. Ranald was given a Japanese guard named Tangaro, who was intent on learning English. So Tangaro would give Ranald a Japanese word. Ranald would write that down, and then they would try by sign to figure out what that was.
Wow.
And Ranald, though discouraged from keeping his dictionary, kept it going the whole time he was in Japan. 2 junks arrived on the 8th day that Ranald was on the island. He's once again interrogated. His goods are inventoried again. They measure him. The funny thing was, one of the crewmen on the junk stepped off, took one look at Ranald and goes, "He's Japanese." And that caused a little bit of a furor. He was Japanese in some aspects, like coloring. However, he was 5'8", so in those days he was considered tall, especially in Japan. He was broad-shouldered and large-chested, stout and muscular. That's what working on a whaling ship will do for you. He was marched from the town he was in to the town of Soya, the second town on the island. And as he was moved in a palanquin, which is basically a box that people carry on either end, his windows were blocked and the house's windows were blocked as he passed by. They didn't want people to see what a real foreigner looked like because foreigners had been demonized for so long in the Japanese territories. So they wanted to keep people thinking these were monsters. From Soya, he was transported to Matsume, which is on southwest Hokkaido. And this was the first time anybody threatened him. Up until now, everybody treated him well. He was fed, he was allowed access to all his belongings. When he was put into a room on Hokkaido, he discovered some English names carved into his prison room, and there was an iron bludgeon there. And at one point, one of his guards said, "You know what could happen to you?" and shows him the bludgeon. His next move was to Nagasaki, which meant that he had to be moved from the north of Hokkaido on Rishiri Island, Hokkaido, and then all the way down to Nagasaki. They just took that junk all the way down through the Sea of Japan, which is very rough sailing. They were Ranald records that some of the sailors were quite sick. He proudly notes he was not. The ship at high speed took 2 weeks to travel the Sea of Japan, and that was considered to be fast, so they had good winds. At Nagasaki, they tried to find interpreters for Ranald so that they could find out what his story was and what his purpose was. And they got so frustrated in trying to communicate, at one point, an interpreter took a Dutch English dictionary and just handed it to Ranald and said, "Find the word in English." And then this interpreter, though Japanese, knew Dutch and dealt with the Dutch traders, and they could then translate it into Japan. This is where we actually have some Japanese records of Ranald's visit. He underwent 2 interrogations at Nagasaki. Most of the foreigners in Nagasaki harbor were Dutch tradesmen, and they were sequestered on Dejima Island. This was an artificial island. It had a land bridge so that you could get to Nagasaki. And they were forbidden to learn Japanese. They were allowed to have 1 Dutch ship land there a year. There were fewer than a dozen men on this island at any one time. Every 5 years, they were allowed to make the trip into Nagasaki, but that was to give tribute to the shogun. And so they were the only ones who were allowed in during this 200 years. They had a 200-year monopoly, basically. The Dutch had managed to train some interpreters so that they could speak to the Japanese and so that they could communicate about trade. And there was the headman of Dejima Island, a Dutchman, also knew how to speak English. And this turned out to be very, very helpful when Ranald arrived. Ranald was very soon given a job. He was to teach English to 14 scholars who already knew Dutch. So these were people with some facility in language. They were samurai who varied in age from 17 to 74 years old. So many different ages and life experiences. They had learned Dutch and spoken it for the last 7 months. One of them was Inosuke Moriyama, and he later became an interpreter for the Japanese when Commodore Perry entered Japan in 1854. So this was one of Ranald's most important contributions to Japan, was that he created an interpreter or taught an interpreter who could then speak English. In 1820, this is a painting of the island. Ranald, however, was not kept on Dejima, but moved inland up in the hills near a temple that had been built when the Christians were martyred, and this was a Shinto temple. It was there that he met a Dutchman, the one who spoke English, Joseph Levison. Levison wrote down Ranald MacDonald's answers to the Japanese questions in Dutch. So this was a very complicated exchange. The magistrate, who spoke only Japanese, said his question to the Japanese who knew Dutch. They translated it to Dutch. Then Levison translated it to English and asked Ranald the question. And then it had to make its way back through the whole chain. And we do actually have a written record of these two interrogations. Ranald was therefore identified as the first native speaker of English to teach in Japan. However, there had been English speakers who had landed, usually in shipwrecks or as deserters from whaling boats. And so the Japanese had some familiarity with English. When Ranald first landed back in Rashiki, they asked him if he wanted grog, obviously a very English word. So the town that he was sequestered in was at Daihinian, near a temple, and he was allowed a futon, a chair, a table, and some clothing. His diet consisted of fish, rice, veggies, tea, Dutch bread, which they got from the Dutch traders, no dairy, pork only once a week because the Japanese did not eat much meat at this time. And Ranald began to worry, are they going to keep me here for my whole life? Is there any way out of this? They withheld his books even though he asked for them. Eventually, they began to trust him, and he gave him back his books, including his Bible, even though they knew what it was and they discouraged Christianity. Ranald received gifts from Levison, the Dutchman, at Christmas, and he was so excited because it included some English newspapers. And he finally got some word about what was happening in the outer world. So Ranald was in Nagasaki for about 10 months. His entire stay in Japan was less than a year. Levison, the Dutchman, had learned about some men that had been stranded from the Lakota, which was an English vessel. And he wanted to rescue them from the Japan. They were a fairly rowdy bunch of men, and they had caused the Japanese a lot of trouble. And the Japanese had punished them. It had been a difficult stay. And so Levison wrote a letter that went out on this once-a-year ship to China, where there was a Dutch council, and the Dutch council gave this letter to the English council in China, and that's how they heard about there were Americans and Englishmen from a whaler on the island and that they probably needed to be rescued. So the council in the American council in China decides to send the Preble, the USS Preble, which was a military ship, to take these captives from the Lakota home. So the Preble sets out for Japan, and they have a smallpox outbreak. And they basically have to turn back to Hong Kong. While they're there, Commander Glenn of the Preble reads about Ranald MacDonald in some old newspapers. He doesn't know whether he's dead or alive, but when he starts to ask for sailors to repatriate, he adds one more person to the count, and that would account for Ranald. Now, Ranald was kept indoors most of the time. It was indeed a prison. However, he was a congenial person. He was never punished, and he was treated fairly well, in part because he was so useful to the Japanese. In 1849, Ranald and the 15 other shipwrecked men from the other ship, the Lagoda, were repatriated, but it couldn't be done directly. In the Japanese laws, it was said that they couldn't be sent directly into the hands of Americans or Europeans. This could only be done through the Dutch colony. So Ranald and these other sailors are shipped onto Dejima, and from there, the Preble can take them back. Ranald joins the Preble somewhat reluctantly, and at Hong Kong, he jumps ship. He says, there's more of the world to see. I've got places to go yet. And he signed on to other ships and made his way to China, India, and Australia. Off of India, he was shipwrecked, and at that point, he lost some of his notes from Japan, but that ship and most of its belongings were recovered and survived. In Australia, there was a gold rush going on, and he says, what the heck? Let's stay in Australia. I'll do some mining. He also headed a gambling house and ran a dance hall. So he was he was an entrepreneur. He was very creative when he traveled. He continued not just through Asia, but in 1953 he shipped out of Australia, and from there went through Rome, Paris, London, and Scotland. This is a daguerreotype of Ranald taken from about that time. And there is one photo of him as an old man. We don't have a whole lot of idea of how he looked. After 3 years of traveling around Europe, he went back to Canada. He arrived shortly after the death of his father. So his father knew that he was alive because they had exchanged letters after he left Japan, but they never got to see each other again. However, his stepmother was still alive, and he did spend some time with her in St. Andrews. Sadly, his stepmother actually outlived 10 of her 12 children and her husband. So this was a very long-lived woman. And she was the woman who, for a large part of his life, Ranald thought was his mother. We'll take a little side trip. From Ranald's life, Admiral Perry arrived in Japan, sent by President Fillmore. We really wanted to trade with these people. And so Perry made 2 trips. This was 5 years after Ranald was gone, but the interpreters that he knew were still there, still working with the Dutch. And the Japanese knew that they would have to deal with Perry because American and English warships kept appearing on the horizon. And eventually, there was going to be a contest between them. So when Perry pulls into port, the Japanese, not wanting to be contaminated, put a message that had been translated from Dutch into English on a pole and raise it to the ship. Perry rips it off and tosses it in the ocean. At that point, the Japanese begin to understand they're going to have to send some real people to talk together for this to proceed at all. Eventually, they develop what is known as the Harris Treaty, which opens support for trade in Japan to the Americans. Eventually, there are other treaties developed between other countries and Japan. So the gates are opened, and this essentially unseats the ruling class and brings an emperor whose power had diminished to almost nothing back to the forefront. So it had a long-term effect in Japan. This is a picture of a Perry meeting. So Ranald MacDonald had trained Inosuke Moriyama. He was a favorite student of Ranald's, and they had talked relatively extensively in English. Um, Moriyama seemed to have a gift for languages and to be fairly wealthy. He had a large library, and he said to Ranald that he was actually also studying Latin and French. Much of the negotiations in this first and second meeting with Perry were actually done in Dutch. Everyone was more, across the board, they seemed to have been more skilled in Dutch than in English. And this forced the end of the Japanese seclusion policy. Back in America, Ranald had aged enormously. He picked up work here and there. In 1861, he did road construction and mining. He had a good nose for gold. In 1858, his half-brother Alan moved to British Columbia. Ranald joined him, and they ran a packing company with a ferry on the side. And later, their youngest brother Benjamin joined them. In 1864, he joined the Victoria Island Exploration Expedition. Ranald was 40 years old at that time. And once again, they discovered gold off of Leech Island. Like I said, he had a nose for the stuff. In 1875, he joined a cousin named Christina, a woman who was running a trading operation at Kamloops. She was a very successful woman and fairly powerful for her time. And when Ranald retired a few years later, he lived near her brother Donald in Fort Colville. So that's where he spent a large portion of the rest of his life, close to a place where his father had been posted. In 1891, Elizabeth Custard shows up. Now, she is the widow of George Armstrong Custard. She's a reporter for Harper's Weekly, and she wants to write this article about the Northwest Territory and all the expansion that's going on there and how wonderful it is. Now, Ranald and she seem to have gotten along fairly well. She interviewed him and made him a major portion of her article, but she really messed up. She said that he broke the trade embargo with China, not Japan. She couldn't even get that right. She also made some racial and economic insults in the article when she described his native relatives and their economic situation. And he never really forgave her for that. He wrote letters to the local newspapers complaining about how she represented the people, and it never went much farther than that, but he took a very strong stance. He started his memoirs quite late in his life. And he joined up with an attorney to try to get them published. Now, they couldn't even round up enough subscriptions to get this published because everybody who had traveled into the new world and around the old world were publishing memoirs. There was a glut on the market. So he couldn't find anybody to publish his memoirs. And they weren't published until after he died in 1923. This was done by the Eastern Washington Historical Society in Spokane. He'd been dead for 29 years at this point. So he never got to see his own work in print. As a writer, that kills you. He was visiting a niece in Washington. He was 70 years old, and he became ill and died. His last words were, "Sayonara, my dear, sayonara." So though this is the end of MacDonald's life, it's not the end of his legacy. And I'd like to take some questions before we take a break, and then I'll talk about what that legacy is and how people get so enthusiastic about Ranald, who was a funny little man who was friendly with everybody. So let's open it up to questions.
Questions from the crowd.
Did he is So the question is, how did I first get to know about Ranald MacDonald? Well, I did a presentation last year for Senior Studies Institute about native Northwestern populations and their poetry. At that point, we're talking about an oral poetry. It wasn't written down until the European anthropologist arrived and started to write it down. So in the process of creating a history of native chants, I decided I needed to know more about different tribes. One of the ones I came across was the Chinook. They were some of the biggest traders. Their language was one that was adopted and adapted for trade. And along the way, I read about Ranald's grandfather, which is a sad story in many ways because he died of a fever. And the tradition was to display the body at the grave in something like a canoe, a monument, and then they would be buried. The problem with Kamkamali was that he was well enough known that a doctor in the area decided that he wanted a trophy. He chopped off Kamkamali's head and sent it to London as an exhibition in the British Museum. And the skull was sent back at some point to the Smithsonian and then back to the tribe for a burial more appropriate. It horrifies me to think that they chopped off somebody's head after he was dead. It's just appalling. Anyway, in reading about Kamkamali, I read about Ranald as a grandson, and I think, oh man, this guy wants to break into the closed Japan. He has to be a poet I can use for my report. So I went looking for a biography and discovered that no, he was not given to poetry. He was given to adventure. And I just kept reading. And what I discovered is that people through history have been interested in Ranald when they discover his background. So here we're about to talk about Ranald's legacy. So the legend began to grow over time. He was virtually forgotten until his memoir was published after he'd passed away, and the memoir sparked some interest. Now I have read the memoir itself, which makes for fairly interesting reading, but I got distracted and annoyed by all the footnotes and annotations of the museum. It's like you can't just read through the story without stumbling over these darn footnotes everywhere. So, two biographies that I looked at were Joanne Rose, Pacific Rim Adventure. And this concept, oh, it's so terrible because it's reversed. You can't see it. And this book very much concentrates on his time in Japan. And the other book was A Native American in the Land of the Shogun by Frederick Schott. And again, a lot of the concentration is on the years in Japan. I preferred this one because the print is larger. It makes it easier to read. So there are various sources about him around. There are also various monuments. He died in Toronto, Washington in 1894. He's buried at the Ranald MacDonald Cemetery in Ferry County, Washington. There is one monument to him there. There's another monument in Nagasaki that was completed in 1964. There's another in Rishiri Island that was completed in 1987, and one in Astoria that was completed in 1988. So 87, 88, in the 80s, his popularity, interest in him gained a little bit of speed. In Japan, as you might be able to see, these are Japanese characters on the monument, the two pictures of it on the left. And more recently, there was a monument to Inosuke Moriyama, the interpreter who he taught, and that was dedicated just in 2014. And it's right, they're right next door to each other. And that's what the third picture is, the two monuments together. A lot of the interest in Ranald is fostered by a group called the Friends of MacDonald, celebrating the life of Japan's first English teacher. And their newsletter is actually called Gates Ajar, which came from the quote on the first slide. I came thus to play my humble part in the drama of Gates Ajar of East and West in the world of the Pacific. The Friends of Ranald MacDonald was formed in 1988. Then it had 13 members. Now it has more than 200. The founders were a Japanese man, Mas Tomita, who was 40 years old, and the president of Epson, the computer-related company in Portland, and Bruce Burney, who was the director of the Astoria Public Library from 1967 to 97. So he was at that library for 30 years. And they stumbled across each other at a meeting. They started to talk about early settlers and early introductions of Japan, and knew something about Ranald. Mas Tomita was interested and didn't have the materials he needed to find out more. The librarian could provide those. They actually first met at Astoria's at McDonald's hamburger shop. Ooh. Ranald's father spelled his name M-C-D-O-N-A-L-D, not like the hamburger joint. Ranald and his siblings all put the A in. It had nothing to do with McDonald's, that's just the way they spelled it. But this idea came to birth in a McDonald's. It was most active around 1994, and it was that activity that spurred some of this movement towards building the monuments that I've talked about. There was a real push to acknowledge his importance in between the two communities. They actually, I think one of their best legacies is the Ranald MacDonald Short-Term Study Abroad program. Juniors at Rishiri High School sign up to come to America and study at a school in the Astoria Spokane region. The program was 6 years old in 2018, the last newsletter I saw, and there were always 2 students sent to America to learn English in its more native environment. And this is one of the most interesting stories about how people get fascinated with Ranald for the strangest reasons or with the strangest results. This is a Japanese style kite. It has 8 sides and a picture of Ranald MacDonald on it. It's called a Rukuku style kite, and it was made using traditional methods with bamboo spars, so the pieces that cross it are bamboo, and handmade washi paper, rice paper. Such kites are often painted with colorful faces of historical samurai heroes or mythological characters. And Japan has a very rich mythology and some of the most amazing ghosts you'll ever read about. The former Friends of Ranald MacDonald chairman, Jim Mockford, selected the design, and he commissioned the Ranald MacDonald Japanese Sankaku style kite to be built by Ron Bohart. This kite was finished in 2017. This kite has a lot of mileage on it. Mockford has intended and tried to take the kite everywhere that Ranald MacDonald went. This happens to be a picture in Hawaii. The organization, the Friends of Ranald MacDonald, flew the kite for its 30th anniversary in 2018. And it has just kept moving ever since then. There's something of a journal of its travels